Hey there, folks. Clyde Chester here, and tonight I want to tell you about one of the strangest characters in American crime history, a man who prowled the rooftops of Denver, Colorado in the 1940s, scaling buildings like a human spider, evading police for years, and becoming an urban legend that captivated a city. I'm talking about the Denver Spider-Man, a real-life cat burglar whose acrobatic skills were so extraordinary that people genuinely wondered if he was superhuman. This is the story of Philip Peters, a man whose crimes were overshadowed by his almost supernatural abilities, and how Depression-era Denver became obsessed with catching a thief who could walk up walls. Let me take you back to 1941, to Denver in the early years of World War II. This was a city still recovering from the Great Depression, a place where people were struggling to make ends meet, where the war in Europe felt both distant and increasingly inevitable. Denver was growing, transforming from a rough western town into a modern city, but it still had that frontier edge, that sense that anything could happen in the shadows of the Rockies. And then, in the summer of 1941, something started happening that defied explanation. Businesses and apartments on the upper floors of downtown buildings, third floor, fourth floor, fifth floor, and higher, started getting burglarized. Not through doors or ground-level windows, but windows that were 20, 30, 40 feet off the ground. Windows that should have been completely inaccessible without a ladder. Windows that people left unlocked specifically because they figured no one could possibly reach them. The Denver police were baffled. How was this burglar getting into these buildings? There were no signs of ladders being used, no rope marks, no disturbance of the fire escapes that might explain how someone was reaching these impossible heights. It was like the thief could fly, or walk up walls, or somehow defy gravity. Witnesses who'd spotted someone on the sides of buildings at night described a figure moving with impossible agility, climbing up brick walls using tiny handholds and ledges that looked far too small to support a person's weight, leaping between buildings across gaps that should have been uncrossable, scaling drain pipes and cornices like it was the easiest thing in the world. The newspapers loved it. They started calling him the Spider-Man or the Human Fly. This was years before the comic book, mind you. This was 1941, and the name was purely descriptive. This burglar moved like a spider, climbed like a spider, seemed to possess abilities that no normal human should have. The Denver Post ran breathless accounts of his exploits, and the public ate it up. During a time when the news was dominated by war and economic hardship, here was a story that felt almost fantastical, like something out of a pulp adventure novel happening right there in Denver. The Spider-Man's targets were calculated and specific. He hit jewelry stores, offices where cash was kept, apartments belonging to wealthy residents. He seemed to scout his locations carefully, knowing exactly when buildings would be empty, which windows would be unlocked, where the valuables would be. He was a professional, not some random punk breaking windows and grabbing whatever he could find. He was methodical, skilled, and apparently fearless when it came to heights. The Denver Police Department was getting desperate. They were being made to look like fools by this one burglar who could apparently scale any building in the city. They tried stakeouts, but the Spider-Man seemed to have an uncanny ability to know when police were watching. They tried posting officers on rooftops, but Denver had hundreds of buildings, and they couldn't watch them all. The Spider-Man would hit one building, and by the time police responded, he'd be gone, vanished into the night like smoke. Detectives started studying the crime scenes obsessively, trying to figure out the Spider-Man's technique. What they discovered was genuinely impressive from a physical standpoint. The burglar was using microscopic imperfections in building facades, tiny gaps between bricks, slight protrusions in the mortar, decorative elements that jutted out mere inches as handholds and footholds. He'd wedge his fingers in cracks barely wide enough to fit, use his toes to grip ledges that were only an inch or two deep, and pull himself up using pure strength and balance. It was rock climbing applied to urban architecture, and it required extraordinary physical conditioning, incredible grip strength, and absolutely zero fear of heights. They also figured out that he was using the building's own architecture against security assumptions. In the 1940s, people secured their ground floor entrances carefully, good locks, barred windows, security measures, but upper floors were often left relatively unsecured because the prevailing wisdom was that no one could reach them without making a lot of noise with a ladder. The Spider-Man had identified this vulnerability and exploited it brilliantly. He was getting into places that people thought were impossible to reach, which meant they hadn't bothered to protect them properly. The burglaries continued through 1941 and into 1942. The Spider-Man hit dozens of locations, stealing thousands of dollars in cash and valuables. He became a folk hero to some people, especially those who were struggling during the Depression and saw him as a kind of Robin Hood figure, though there's no evidence he gave anything to the poor. He was just a very skilled thief. But the mystique around him grew. People started claiming to have seen him scaling buildings at night, describing him as moving with superhuman speed and agility. Some reports got wildly exaggerated, stories of him leaping 20 feet between buildings, climbing completely smooth walls, disappearing in impossible ways. The police tried everything. They brought in climbing experts to advise them. They studied the Spider-Man's routes, trying to predict where he'd strike next. They increased patrols in downtown Denver, focusing on the areas he preferred. Nothing worked. The Spider-Man stayed one step ahead, and with each successful burglary, he became more legendary. Then, in late 1942, the Spider-Man made his first mistake. He burglarized a building in downtown Denver, but this time someone saw him clearly enough to provide a detailed description. The witness described a man in his 30s, athletic build, wearing dark clothing and what looked like special shoes, possibly with rubber soles for better grip. It wasn't much, but it was more than the police had before. Detectives started canvassing gyms, athletic clubs, anywhere someone with extraordinary climbing abilities might train. They were looking for someone with upper body strength, someone who might have experience with gymnastics or acrobatics, someone who fit the physical profile. And they started hearing about a guy named Philip Peters. Philip Peters was 31 years old in 1943, and he fit the description perfectly. He was an athlete, an acrobat who'd worked in circuses and vaudeville shows. He had the exact physical skills you'd need to scale buildings, the strength, the balance, the fearlessness. He'd been living in Denver for several years, and the timing of his arrival corresponded with when the Spider-Man burglaries started. Detectives started watching him, building a case. On March 23, 1943, they finally caught him. Philip Peters was arrested while attempting to burglarize a building on Welton Street in downtown Denver. Police had been tailing him for days, and they'd positioned officers on surrounding rooftops, ready to cut off his escape routes. When Peters made his move, scaling the side of the building with the same incredible agility witnesses had described, the police were ready. They grabbed him on the rooftop, and the legend of the Denver Spider-Man came to an end. When they searched Peters' apartment, they found burglars' tools and stolen property linking him to multiple crimes. They also found the special equipment he used, soft-soled shoes with extra grip, chalk for his hands to improve friction, gloves with reinforced fingertips. It wasn't supernatural ability, it was skill, preparation, and physical conditioning. Peters had trained for this. He'd taken his acrobatic abilities and applied them to crime, turning his body into a tool for reaching places no one else could access. The press coverage of Peters' arrest was massive. The Denver newspapers ran front-page stories with photos of Peters demonstrating his climbing technique for the police. They showed him scaling brick walls, hanging from ledges by his fingertips, moving across building facades in ways that looked impossible even when you were watching him do it. The photos proved that he wasn't superhuman, he was just extraordinarily skilled. But they also showed why he'd been so successful for so long. What Peters could do with his body was genuinely remarkable. Peters went to trial in 1943, and it was a media circus. People packed the courtroom, wanting to see the legendary Spider-Man in person. The prosecution presented evidence of multiple burglaries, and Peters didn't really dispute the facts. He'd done it, he admitted it, the evidence was overwhelming. His defense focused on his difficult economic circumstances, his lack of other opportunities, his desperation during hard times. It didn't matter. The jury found him guilty on multiple counts of burglary, and the judge sentenced him to 15 to 20 years in the state penitentiary. Philip Peters served his time at the Colorado State Penitentiary in Canyon City, Colorado. Reports from the prison indicate he was a model inmate, quiet and well-behaved. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A man who could scale any building was now locked in a cell he couldn't escape from. He was released on parole in the early 1950s after serving about 8 years, and then he disappeared from public record. No one knows what happened to Philip Peters after his release. He might have changed his name, moved to another city, tried to start over with a clean slate. He might have gone straight, might have returned to crime, might have lived out his days in obscurity. The Spider-Man who captivated Denver simply vanished. But the